My name is George Banks. We're going to go ahead and kick off our session here today. I'm an associate professor at UNC Charlotte, and I'm pleased to introduce the Introductory Reviewer Development Workshop, which is being co-organized by the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology, SIOP, as well as CARMA, the Consortium for the Advancement of Research Methods Analysis. I'm very excited to share, to introduce today a series of panels. So we have 3 panels, each about 45 minutes long. These panels are a part of a broader initiative to provide some training and development related to a series of competencies for individuals who have limited to no experience reviewing. We also hope that the training, though, will be a wonderful refresher, as I found myself, for those of us who already have experience reviewing. Before I proceed any further, I'd like to go ahead and give a big thank you to SIOP, as well as SIOP's Education and Training Committee for organizing a lot of today's content and helping to promote the event, as well as CARMA for their support as well for organizing the event. And I'd like to give a very, very big thank you for all of our panelists today. We've got many international panelists from around the world. And they're taking time out of their day to share with us their wonderful experiences, both as reviewers as well as associate editors and editor-in-chiefs. And also, I very much appreciate their flexibility in terms of timing, because we have panelists around the world. Many of them will be joining us either very late at night or very, very early in the morning. Okay, so a couple of other logistical tidbits before we get started. We'll have each of our 3 panels. The panels will last about 45 minutes long. We have a total of 9 competencies to be introduced and 9 panelists. So each panelist will speak for approximately 5 minutes or so. Then we'll open it up for some discussions so that the panelists can contribute and discuss some of each other's points. And then time permitting, at the end of each session, we'll open it up for questions. So you can share questions with me, and I'll facilitate with the panel in a variety of ways. You can email me directly at gbanks3@uncc.edu. You can also submit the questions to me through the chat function here at Zoom. And also, we've had a couple of questions about this. All of these panels are going to be recorded. So these panels will be available. We'll post them shortly after today. And make them available on our website, and they'll be there along with the other resources affiliated or associated with the Reviewer Development Workshop. Okay, so time to go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased. We have got a great first panel. So we'll be joined by Stephen Rogelberg and Janaki Gooty, who are both at UNC Charlotte. They are affiliated with the Management Department and also the Psychology Department, and Jane Lee from WHU, who's also affiliated with the Management Department there. All right, so that being said, I'll go ahead and turn things over, I believe, to Stephen Rogelberg, who will kick us off with the first competency.
All right. Well, thanks, George. This is really exciting. I'm very glad to be part of it. All right, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Oh, I'm getting your screen. So I'm not getting my screen. I'm getting, Jane, can you mute your audio for a moment? And I think that will, is it muted? Yeah, I'm actually, George, I'm not listed as a co-host.
Let's see if I can share slides on my end for you. Will that work for you?
Oh, of course.
Can you see the slides?
I can. They look great.
They look spectacular.
All right, good. All right, so when we think about reviewer integrity, we can really think of it being relevant both before, during, and post review. And so I want to share some points at each one of these phases. And obviously, we'll have time to discuss any of these, so I'm going to go fairly quickly. So first of all, if you have a clear conflict of interest, don't review the paper. However, what's often the case with reviewers is that they think they might have a potential conflict of interest, and they rule themselves out. And it really often isn't. So they might think they know the author, they might think they've seen this paper, and a good rule of thumb is when in doubt, just reach out to the editor and disclose and see what the editor wants to do. It's rare that we can find, every reviewer for every single paper who is completely 100% agnostic to any of the authors. So just disclose and we can see where it goes. Also remember when you're considering accepting a review to do the review, sometimes reviewers think that if they don't know every single analytic approach or every single piece of the literature, that maybe they're not a qualified reviewer. Really a good rule of thumb is if you understand the majority of what's in the paper, you are okay as a reviewer. But again, use that editor comment box to disclose what your limitations are so the editor can contextualize your review. And then certainly remember that once you accept that decision, you have a responsibility to do it in a timely and high quality way. I love being an editor, but the thing I hate the most is chasing down reviews. When we have to chase down reviews, the entire editorial process comes to a halt, and it's not constructive for our science. And finally, if you do want to involve others, there's many journal practices that encourage folks to, for example, weave their students into the review process. Again, you just disclose. So the overarching theme is, when in doubt, ask and disclose and have that conversation with the editor. George, next slide. Awesome. All right, so remember when you're doing a review, it's often the case that you need to do some due diligence. You can throw in the topic on Google Scholar to be sure all the papers are in there, the appropriate review. Just give a look. If there's an analytic approach that you're iffy on, well, do a little research on it. Basically, competency is an underlying component of integrity, and a reviewer might be required to do that. As I mentioned earlier, when you put comments in that editor-only section, they're useful for these kind of disclosures, limitations, but remember that when you do have substantive comments, make sure that what you say to the editor aligns with what you say to the authors. It's not at all constructive when the reviewer says to the editor, I hate this paper, this is garbage, it will go nowhere for these reasons, but then in the actual review, those reasons aren't discussed. So make sure there's alignment. Another integrity issue is recognizing that that the research shows, in a study by Emerson, that we can be biased by null results. Namely, when we see null results, we often, in turn, assume that the methodology is sound. But when we see significant results, we often think, the methodology is sound. And our role as reviewers is to try to divorce the question and how it's being asked with the actual results. So we want to evaluate research, and if it's a compelling question, answered in compelling ways, the results really don't matter. The results are what the results are. And we want our evaluation to really go firmly into the question and the methodology, and that the analyses were handled in a highly competent manner and discussed highly competently. Also, it's always important to remember that as reviewers, we might have the tendency in our efforts to improve a paper to suggest questionable research practices. We don't want to encourage authors in any way to develop new hypotheses given certain results that we noticed, to drop certain results, or any kind of p-hacking. So it's something to be very sensitive to. Relatedly, when it comes to literature, we want to, if we see gaps in the literature, certainly we should suggest other literature that should be included in the paper, but we don't want to privilege literature that was produced by us or just the journal in question. We want to give literature that matters to the question at hand. And at any point, if a conflict of interest emerges, again, just reach out. And at no time try to find out who the authors are, because it's just counterproductive to the integrity of the review process. And final slide. So post-review integrity. There are a few points here to remember. First of all, remember that this whole review process is highly confidential, and you are not to distribute the paper or any documentation as part of the review process to anyone. Forwarding it to a grad student saying, hey, this is kind of neat, you should check this out, is unethical and shouldn't be done. And at the same time, and it's quite obvious, is that what you have just read is not yours. It is, everything belongs to the author, the content, and the ideas, and we can't leverage that information. We have to respect that this content is owned by someone else. And finally, as a reviewer, not only do we want to be competent in doing the review, but we want to recognize that we are constantly learning and evolving beings. And as a result, when the review process comes to a close, we want to get better at it. That's how we serve the science, by developing these skills so that we can evaluate others' research in the highest quality manner. So therefore, we have to carefully read the decision letter by the editor, but also the other reviews, and keep trying to identify where we may have had some blind spots so we can do better next time. Also, many authors don't realize this, but there are a host of editors who are very happy to share with you feedback post-review. At Journal of Business and Psychology, we welcome any reviewer to reach out. We'll tell you your score, because all reviews are given a rating, and give you feedback. Because we recognize that it's also our responsibility to try to help you develop these skills so that ultimately the pool of reviewers is not only highly competent, but also acting with great integrity. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Jane, would you like to proceed next?
There we go. So I'm just building on what was just said, and especially the comment about being aware of your own limitations and competence. So I'm shying away from using technology today because I fully expect failure. So I'm just using notes and doing a little short 5-minute conversation about it. And in terms of framing it, I think it would be quite helpful to remind the audience that although all of these competencies are separate, they are related. So you're going to hear a little bit of overlap in terms of what we say, and I think that's a really good thing and something to be aware of. So what I wanted to do is start off with the notion of open-minded and what it means when we think about it in the context of reviewing. So if we look at it from a competency perspective, there's a few key things. So stay in tune to and open to new topics and techniques. So the focus is both on kind of the literature and your familiarity with it, as well as methodologically. So we're looking at it from those two perspectives. It also means that you need to be aware of the difference between positivistic and interpretive work. So is it qualitative or quantitative? And don't make a qualitative project quantitative or vice versa. The other thing is that when you assess that research, that really should be done based on the proposed paradigm. So in line with the way that the paper was intended to be written, rather than based on our own notions of ontology or epistemology. The other thing is recognizing that diversity is positive. So good research comes in a variety of different forms. And that means when we assess those approaches, we really look at them in terms of their own strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes our own strengths and weaknesses. So where we don't know and where we reach the limits of our competence, then sometimes that means doing more research and reading. And then the last thing is, and I think as important as any of the other points, is that we want to work with the voice of the authors. So what is their intended contribution? What is the storyline that they are trying to bring forward in that paper? And that's the focus. So that's the kind of overarching competence that we're talking about. So when I reflect on that, as kind of an editor of special issues, book series, as a member of an editorial board, or even just as an ad hoc reviewer, from my perspective, one of the most important things that I see or that I would critique in people is that they attack the core premise of an approach or method. So they might say, oh, I do not believe this way of seeing the world, or I don't think this is an appropriate methodology. And I would always encourage people not to do that, because the whole point is that you're making a judgment based on your own paradigm and your own way of seeing the world. So what you actually end up doing is closing down or narrowing down what is possible as part of the review process. And that's really dangerous for science. So that would be my first point. The second point is, because diversity is good, we need to be open to it. And that is important because it brings innovation, it brings divergence away from the norms, and as a result of that, hopefully, if executed well, novelty of contribution. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to push forward the field, and hopefully the work that we review and contribute to in that way helps to advance the field. So what I always say is, how do you know when something is, let's say, a meaningful innovation, and when something's just random stuff that happens? I think the core judgment is that, is it meaningful? Does it advance contribution, either in terms of the way that we conceptualize and theorize the work, or in the way that we methodologically approach it? And clearly those two things have to be aligned. So meaningful focus on the theory, meaningful focus on the methods, and an alignment between the two is critically important to that diversity. So I would always encourage reviewers, don't be an enforcer of the status quo. Be aware of it, of course, but don't enforce it. Be someone who is a quality control mechanism that ensures that we understand the criteria of good science and are able to apply that flexibly and appropriately to a wide range of work. And then the last point I want to make, and I think Steve made this very well, is be aware of your own limitations. It's okay to say to an editor, I can only do a partial review of this paper. I don't know this, body of theory. I know, management in general, and I can give you an impression, but I'm not an expert. Or you could say, I'm very sorry, this is not my method, and I can't read up for this review everything ever to know about structural equation modeling because I'm an interpretive scholar. But you could acknowledge that and say, I can give you a surface review of that. What I can contribute to, where I do have an expert voice, where I can give you a reflection, are these areas. And I think if you do that, then you're being both open to various different approaches and helping build contributions in new areas, as well as doing that with integrity. That's all I want to say about that for now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. All right, Janaki, Gooty, are you ready to go next?
Yes, I think I am, if I can be heard. Hi, everyone. Following up on what Stephen just said and what Jane just said, I'm going to speak a little bit about constructiveness in reviewing. And George, are you able to share slides or no?
Yes, I can share your slides. Would you like me to do that?
Yes, please. Thank you. So while George is pulling this up, I assume that George is doing a presentation too, and I use the exact same format of slides that he sent me on something else. Okay, so I only have a few points to talk about because this is 5 minutes. And I want to get into what I have seen in terms of good letters that I've received, when I've received R&Rs, things that have really helped me craft the manuscript better or respond to the revision in a way that is successful. And I also want to focus on what I've learned from those letters and now I implement in my own reviewing, and also what we try and teach our doctoral students. So the first thing, of course, everyone says this, but it's so important to reiterate that we only focus on those big picture strengths and issues and challenges. So very often we'll say something such as, this is a really great manuscript, and jump right into what we don't like about the manuscript. But I'm learning, and this is from a few letters that I've seen that have been so influential for me in my own work, that you actually identify what was really great about the work, what was something that the authors did that makes the paper really suitable for revision, at least, that it has the potential to be published in that journal. So I always begin now with identifying what the big picture strengths are, as well as, and very specifically what the strengths are. Was it theory? Was it method? Was it that it was this area and this little linkage that even the authors might have failed to mention as a contribution, as a hook, but it was something that you noticed and you liked that very much. And then, of course, we jump into things that could be improved upon. And I always make it a point to separate these out into different sections. And I'll talk about this a little later. But for now, I would like to also point out that even when we are starting to identify things that are what we consider major issues in a letter, in the letters that we are writing, or in the review that we are writing to authors or to the editors, I've become a big fan of actually copy pasting specific statements. So saying something like, these arguments, the arguments you made on page 3 through 18 are not making sense, is very different from saying, here are a few statements that illustrate how your theory is not integrated well enough, or here are a few statements that illustrate how you're being contradictory or tautological. And when I have done that for reviewers, for authors, I find that they're much more easily able to respond to comments about how to improve their front ends. So that I find is a very good strategy if you can focus on specific statements rather than making broad general statements about revise your theory or find a new theory. And once I finish writing about what is it that I see as major limitations, I try and visualize how would I respond to these comments. If this were my co-author telling me, or a friendly reviewer saying this about my work, what would I do to make the paper better, and how would I respond to these comments? And those are the kinds of alternatives. You have to propose about 2 to 3 alternatives that could help alleviate some of the issues that you are pointing out as things that are challenging about the paper, or things that are limitations about the paper. So I always try now to throw out at least 2 or 3 alternatives. And again, like, the thing to do with all of those is preface it by saying, and I learned this from an AE who wrote a great letter for me recently, and he said, you're the expert in this topic area, but here are 3 alternatives. I leave it to your judgment to pick which one of these 3 alternatives. But what was really constructive about that comment was he gave me 3 alternatives to think through, and ultimately it is still my voice coming through, as Jane just said, right? But I really appreciated having those ideas. I don't know how we could talk about constructiveness without getting into a little bit of what not to do here. And this is my pet peeves, where we all throw our favorite theories at each other. So if you're a social exchange person, every review we do, we say, why not invoke social exchange, or your favorite model, whatever it might be. It's not fair to simply throw your theoretical viewpoints at people's work, or even to simply say, I disagree with your theory, or like Jane was just saying, the core premise of your methodological contribution, or your theoretical contribution for that matter. George, could we go to the next slide? And on that note, I also, this is a more obvious one, and I think like most of us do this, I try and separate my comments into major and minor issues, things that might be along the lines of, why did you drop an item from this scale, versus here's a major variable that you missed measuring that could affect pretty much everything you're doing. So, we really need to parse those out for authors. So we are also signaling AEs, because as a reviewer, our job is to help the AE write that decision letter. So you're trying to signal the AE that these are the things that I really need you to pay attention to. The other things might be negotiable. And also theory and methods. Personally, I don't comment much on a discussion on the first round, because I wait till the paper comes back, but that might just be a personal preference. I'm not sure that's a best practice though. This next one, again, is something I think we often lose sight of. New theory, novel theory is not always a requirement at every journal. And it's very important to keep that in mind when we are reviewing papers. In fact, I think JBP says a couple of things about this, that you don't necessarily need new theory, and you don't necessarily need significant findings. And these are 2 things I think that we simply cannot drive home enough, because there are a lot of journals now that say that we really don't require new theory with every single paper. And that might not just be a replication, it might just be an integration of previous theories. But whatever the case might be, it's not required that we jump in and say there's nothing novel about this paper, there's nothing unique about this paper, because science is about more than simply producing new knowledge. And the next one is, I found myself trying to do this many times, where you're trying to copy edit. I almost try to go to track changes when I'm reviewing papers on my computer sometimes, because you want to try and copy edit people's authors' papers, or try and rewrite their front end really. And that is, again, something that's a do not, as in we try and stay away from that. And the final thing is, about data, and I'm sure different reviewers and AEs will have different opinions on this. But when I think about this from an author standpoint, asking people to collect data, more data than what they've presented in their original manuscript, should always be the ultimate very last option. And the reason for that is, just simply thinking about the time investment that goes into collecting new data sets, and or if you would want authors and reviewers to come back and say that about your work, right? Now, in some cases, that's very well justified. There might be papers where there is no option but to go to new data sources or fresh data sources. But I think very carelessly asking for new data is something that perhaps we should all try to stay away from. And that is all I have for now. Thank you.
Great. All right, thank you, Janaki, for that. Okay, so now I'd like to open things up to our panelists to comment on each other's comments. So there certainly seemed like there were a lot of positive relations between a lot of the points that you guys are making. So now would be a good opportunity if you wanted to comment on each other's kind of key points and maybe make some comparisons there. And also for our audience members, now would also be a good time if you have questions for the panelists. Again, you can feel free to send me the messages via chat, or you can also email me at gbanks3@uncc.edu. Okay, our panelists?
I'll just make a couple comments. First of all, I thought Jane and Janaki were awesome. I thought their points were so fantastic. And a couple things that I would just want to emphasize, and kind of Jane cued me on this, is for reviewers to remember that this is not their paper. This is someone else's paper. And it's not your job to rewrite this paper so that it aligns perfectly with who you are as a scholar. And I think you have to respect the fact that there is not just a single best way of doing things in our science, and respect the voice of that author. And I think that also not only applies to the first time you read the paper, but if it's a revision, it's not your job to keep making sure that this thing gets revised 3, 4, 5 times. It's not constructive to our science. I think, so I wanted to share that. And then just 2 quick points with Janaki's. So the first thing is, the constructiveness, her comments around the constructiveness were I thought spot on. What I always encourage all reviewers to do is, be the reviewer that you would always want, right? So the reviewer you want is someone that is well-informed, very constructive, provides alternatives, is critical, because that's what's good for science, but is not mean-spirited, or a reviewer that only sees things in one and only one way. Now, granted, when it comes to analytic choices, there might be just one way, but that's not always the case for other things. And the other quick point I wanted to make, and I really appreciate Janaki's comment around focusing on major and then minor. Sometimes I see new reviewers, they organize their comments by intro, method, results, and discussion, and that's definitely not as helpful to an editor. We just want to know what's critical to you, what are the real things influencing your overall opinion of this paper, and what are the things that are, it's kind of like must-have versus be nice to have. And focus on, get those must-haves down, and then the nice-haves can be identified differently.
Other comments from Janaki or Jane? Things you'd like to add?
I would just echo what's already been said. I think that luckily we've been consistent, and I think we probably have had similar experiences in the review process and have seen and learned over time what is more constructive. And I guess that's the other thing to acknowledge. It is a learning journey. And the first time you review, you're going to make some mistakes, and the editor is there to help guide you and maybe soften some of the things that you've said and help you through that process. But the onus is on you to get better over time. So, like you would do with anything, trial some reviews at conferences, maybe some conference papers, then go up to, a minor journal, move up to the big league after that, because the onus can't be on the editor to edit everybody's reviews. So I just acknowledge it is a learning journey. It gets easier and quicker and better over time. And, I think it is really important to have that review process and diversity of review, which includes feedback from junior scholars and people new to the review process.
I just have.
Right. So I've got a couple. Johnny, can go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo a couple of things that Stephen and Jane have already said, but a couple of things that I actually missed on the constructiveness thing. And some of the things that Stephen said cued me onto this. You know, the thing that I wanted to say is we have to remember that labeling work is not useful to authors. Many times reviewers will come back and say something along the lines, if this was said to me and I had no idea where to go with it, that my theorizing was pedestrian. And you have no way of moving forward with that comment because was my theory supposed to run, not walk? You know, my point here is do not use labels that do not help authors, right? You have to be very specific in terms of why this might not fit the situation. And the other thing, and I see this more and more as well, not only in the things I'm reviewing, but you know, from other reviewers, is more complex statistics and methods are not always the solution to every paper. You know, many times when you get a paper that does not require additional complex mediated moderation or bootstrapping or something, reviewers will just throw that in just because they saw that in a different paper that needed it. And it's very important for us to carefully think through if those advanced statistics that we're asking for are simply more complexity in statistics and methods is always needed, you know, and I think that's a big part of being constructive too. Thank you, George.
Hey, George, can I just make a quick comment before you go to the question, building off something Jane had said?
Go for it.
So Jane had made a good point about, you know, you need to get better over time, and you will get better over time. But I also want to emphasize that, as I mentioned earlier, every review gets a score. And if I use an ad hoc reviewer and that person gets a bomb of a score, I actually don't give them a second chance. Because I have to maintain the integrity of this scientific process. And so I can't risk it. I can't risk authors not getting high quality reviews. But Jane is 100% right. So how do you reconcile these two positions? And the fact is, if you haven't done reviewing as a grad student, being mentored by your chair, then it's certainly, as a new faculty member, you can ask the editor, can you do this review with someone else? You know, weave in a trusted individual and do the review together. And if you need to do that for a few times just to really hone your skills, that's a great activity. And, you know, really, you know, I know for my doctoral students, I'm always happy to do reviews with them to help them develop those competencies.
Great. All right, thank you all. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I've picked from some of the questions that have come in. So I have one for each one of you. So I'll go ahead and read them off now just so that you can be thinking about it while the others are answering. So one here, I think this pertains to Janaki's points. So a question came in: how do you differentiate reviewing as a task for a conference versus a journal paper in terms of how much level of detail you're providing for your constructive feedback? And I'll quickly read off the other two so Jane and Stephen can start thinking. Jane, in terms of keeping an open-mindedness for reviewing different types of methodologies, at what point do you stop kind of reading additional material? How much time, energy should you really be investing in learning some of these new techniques? And last one for Stephen, when providing reviewer comments related to research methods, how do you disentangle criticisms of rigor of the methods from comments that might relate to the outcome so that you don't confuse authors and maybe potentially confuse yourself, letting kind of your assessment of the rigor be influenced to some extent by some of the conclusions that are being reached? So Janaki, if maybe you could go first.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for a second about, you know, other than the length of the review, what else do I do differently between conferences and journals? And I think like the first thing is to keep in mind that the idea, think about why we are reviewing that paper. The idea behind reviewing a conference submission, in addition to the fact that we're trying to determine if it should be accepted, is also to give people some feedback on preparing it for journal submission. So with a conference submission, I focus more on, you know, what would get this paper from here to being ready for a journal submission, if not there already. You know, sometimes you get papers that are already there. And of course, there's a more obvious answer, which is also about my length of review tends to be different for both. And for all the program chairs out there for conferences, they're going to get mad at me. So please don't cite me on this. But for conferences, I typically do two to three paragraphs, focus on the big picture issues. I don't try to copy edit people's papers anyway. And with conferences, it's even less so. I don't try to give them feedback on typos and things like that, which a lot of people do. For journals, it's a little more serious. And this is where you try and signal the AE to make the decision. And we do that with program chairs and track chairs as well, but there it's really a big picture view. And here it's more of a, you're trying to say, okay, maybe yes, a revision, or no, this definitely has some major issues. But, now when you say yes, a revision, part of my mindset is always that you never recommend, as a reviewer, you don't recommend a revision unless you feel like you can personally see the paper through. If you were the AE, you should be able to see that paper through, right? So revision, that's my mindset. So essentially you have to think about, what do I need to say here to get authors from this point of, they just submitted to a successful R&R. So those are the differences, I would say, between conference submissions and journal submissions, primarily in terms of intended outcomes.
Great. Jane, would you like to go next?
Yep. So the question was, how much new reading and learning do you do for a review? And the answer is not too much. So it's about topping up knowledge. If you haven't read a few recent papers that the paper heavily builds on, have a look at them and make sure that they've been understood, or you understand the basic premise of those papers before continuing. And follow up some of the new references. Maybe look at the core elements of a new method that you haven't come across before. But it's really a matter of complementing your existing skills and just topping up some of that. So it's really not about going out and learning about structural equation modeling and all the ins and outs of it, if that is not your area of expertise. It's really just about making sure that you're across some of the core things the paper builds on in terms of basic familiarity. I mean, if you really don't know something, the more credible thing, because you're not going to learn it in a couple of hours, is to say to the editor, hey, I don't know this, I'm not an expert. I can give you my opinion as a management scholar on this work, having read broadly, but I'm not an expert. And that's what I would do. So it's more about making sure that those areas that you have expertise in, if they're being pushed to the boundary, making sure you can follow.
Great, thank you, Jane. All right, Stephen, you wrap things up for us?
Okay, so I guess the question was how to do a review basically without being overly influenced by the actual findings. Is that fair?
Yep.
So what I encourage, and it's a great question, and what I encourage reviewers to do is, read the intro and the methods extremely carefully, form 85 to 90% of your judgment just based solely on the intro and methods. Are the questions highly compelling? Are they highly grounded? Do they create a theoretical or conceptual or practical contribution? Go to the methods. Is the study highly powered? Is it using measures that are meaningful? And once you fully read that intro and methods, you should be pretty close to knowing whether this paper is publishable. At that point, it's just seeing whether the results is delivering on what they said they were going to do, and the discussion is contextualizing it. I think it's very much akin to what we do all the time when we evaluate a student's dissertation or thesis, right? We focus on the questions and how they're answered. We don't make our passing of that student dependent on whether the hypotheses are supported. It's passed on whether it's a compelling project executed in a highly compelling way. And as a reviewer, we have to discipline ourselves to kind of bring that same mindset to evaluating the quality of the manuscript and how it advances our science. Because ultimately, we want our science to have a myriad of results, from those that are significant to those that are not significant, when they're generated by a high-quality methodology.
Great. Thank you, and I'm glad you made that point. I think many of us maybe wouldn't have graduated had we needed to find lots of statistically significant results in our dissertation. So. All right, do any of the panelists have any other final thoughts you want to add before we wrap things up? This has been a really great session. I'm really excited about all the great insight you've shared.
Thank you, George, for being the leader on this. It was a great effort.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so
thank you, George.
Appreciate it. All right, so this concludes our very first panel. So special thanks again to Janaki, Stephen, and Jane for joining us. Again, we're at different time zones, and so I appreciate everyone's flexibility, making this align. So this will conclude our first panel, and we'll begin our second panel in about 3 minutes. So thank you very much, and we'll be back.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.